Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu ala Rasulullah. We shall begin, inshallah, reading from Imam Al-Ghazali's book 22 of Ihya Ulumuddin on Riyadat al-Nafs, disciplining the soul. It has been translated into English and published along with book 23, of course, the Ihya Ulumuddin on breaking the two desires, كتاب كسر الشهوتين, translated with the introduction and notes by T.J. Winter, Abdul Hakim Murad, by the Islamic Texts Society in Cambridge, 1995. The introduction is lengthy, but it's worth reading and literally enjoying it. And most probably we need a few sessions to read the introduction. And we shall begin. Bismillah. Introduction. First part, preliminary remarks. To some extent, the history of Muslim mystical literature mirrors the two stages of technique and experience, which are its subject. Although there is evidence to suggest that a direct experience of the divine was a conditioning fact of much early Muslim piety, the sober articulation of this encounter was not attempted for several hundred years. I would add, knowing Imam Al-Ghazali's language narrative regarding such an issue, I would summarize it as probably human language, which is still a sign from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Alsun, the languages. وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا. So the language in its essence is God-given, not the acquisition that we talk about, but because there was no social context for Adam to learn the language, so it has to be from outside. And of course, the ability to speak all the instruments that the human being has, vocal cords, hearing. At any rate, human language and human experience is not adequate to reflect such an experience, a direct experience of the divine. So the sober articulation of this encounter was not attempted for several hundred years, and an orthodoxy had to coalesce from countless different strands before it could withstand the shock of an Islamic monism. And even when the impact came, climaxing with the elegant and uncompromising gnosis of men like here it is said Ibn al-Arabi and al-Jili. I'm sure that by Ibn al-Arabi, Abdul Hakim Murad is really talking about Ibn Arabi rather than Ibn al-Arabi. And if you would like to know the difference, Ibn Arabi is described as Muhyiddin, the Sheikh al-Akbar. He's the author of فصوص الحكم فتوحات المكية. Some narratives are still considered controversial, and of course his student, or at least one of his students, of course, is Jalaluddin Rumi, who of course the author of the Mathnawi. Remember Qunya, if you include it in your itinerary for future travel. And Ibn Arabi, this is Ibn Arabi, the Sufi. Ibn al-Arabi is also Andalusian, but one might say that he ended up more following the methodology of Ahl al-Hadith, though he did have an encounter with Imam Al-Ghazali. So we talk about two different persons. So uncompromising gnosis of men like Ibn Arabi now, we correct it, and Al-Jili. Al-Jili is Abdul Karim Al-Jili, who was born in Baghdad in 767 of the Islamic calendar. That's 1365. And he's the author of Al-Insan al-Kamil, translated sometimes as the universal man. The concept of Al-Kamil is an intriguing concept. يا ليته كان كاملا. Whether we talk about the person or we talk about the action, which is usually the case. So uncompromised gnosis of men like Ibn Arabi and Al-Jili, the consequent friction was intense. Only the preceding centuries of moderate devotional mysticism legitimized Sufism sufficiently for this to occur at all. Part of Ghazali's significance lies in his historical situation at the isthmus between these two traditions, authentically at home both in the idiom of ascesis with its fasts and meditations on death, and in the controlled ecstasy of a metaphysic of encounter, which had absorbed the best of Neoplatonism. So that was it. There was a trend to be tough with oneself, if you will. Like if you think about Abu Yazid al-Bastami living in the prairies of Baghdad, literally subsisting on herbs only, nothing else. That would be tough. And while this might be definitely intended for personal salvation, it doesn't work from a communal perspective. And I think this is not discussed enough in Islamic circles. So, with his fasts and meditations on death and the controlled ecstasy of a metaphysics of encounter, which had absorbed the best of Neoplatonism, he is the Janus of Muslim thought. Neoplatonism there are studies about the Neoplatonic concepts that are present in Imam al-Ghazali's works, but for the most part, Neoplatonism was manifests itself ultimately in Ismaili theology, especially when we talk about the elevation of Ali bin Abi Talib radiallahu anhu. It's not a small issue to discuss. It is from this rather than from any unique originality that his prestige derives. He defined an equilibrium between letter and spirit, which, despite the continuing vitality of both extremes, was to determine the tenor of Muslim religious life from his day on. Originally, it was letter and spirit. Spirit disappeared for a while, especially from jurisprudential discourse. And so this is why it is ihya. It's not inventing anything. It is going back to the original it's not that we say reconciliation in the sense that there was tension. The problem is that the spiritual discourse was dropped from books of fiqh. Literally, it's a dry, very dry. And I mean, there's no spirituality. If you talk about the division of water, for example, with which books of jurisprudence would start, purification, tahara, so division of water. It's a down to earth discussion, not even discussion, simply, and there is no spirituality there. Imam Ghazali in Ihya Ulumuddin, he reintroduced spirituality, whether we talk about purification, talk about prayer, which should be definitely about spirituality, not ignoring the you know the obligatory part of prayers, or the sunnah. Same thing goes for fasting, rather than a technical definition of abstinence from food and water and intimate relationship between spouses from dawn until sunset. We we have elaborate spiritual content. So I'm trying to explain what Abdul Hakim Murad is trying to say about Imam Ghazali falling, creating an equilibrium between both extremes. The It is the field itself. Even if you are a spiritual person, the nature of the narrative in jurisprudence was such that it did not include. It became they have neglected the spiritual part, which was very present in the life of the early Muslim community, because that's really the original Islamic worldview. And by saying that Imam Ghazali determined the tenor of Muslim religious life from his day on, it's true. There's no elevation above. That's not, there's nothing perfect, and because no one is beyond the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There are certain things that, of course, anyone who is interested in Imam Ghazali would know that the shortcomings would include the prophetic traditions that are not sound, just simply to give an example. But nevertheless, he continues to shape Islamic spirituality. Ghazali was a polymath who excelled in most of the traditional Islamic disciplines. In most, because, of course, one can see that there are certain trends even within Islamic scholarship. There are statements that a muhaddith, by definition, a scholar of hadith, is not a jurist. So they might lack the tools for ijtihad. So to be able to decipher a hadith, the chain of narrators, whether it's sound or not, that's one thing. But to be able to extract the fiqh of the hadith as a different field. So for Imam Ghazali, he was a faqih, he was a theologian. He wrote about philosophy, logic, etc., etc. Except that when it reached basically hadith, he said وَبَضَعْتِ فِي عِلْمِ حديث مزجع, that he was relatively speaking, that was not his strongest point, let's say. His was the distinction of refuting those aspects of Greek philosophy which were thought to contradict truths received in the Islamic scriptures. His also were some of the most serious works of Aristotelian logic, of Islamic jurisprudence. And we know that he wrote several works in, say, for example, if we talk about Al-Basit, Al-Wasit, Al-Wajiz, and other works. In theory, the definitive rebuttal of the Ismaili sect. Systematically, Imam Ghazali wrote several works against the Batinites, the Ismaili esoterics, throughout his life. فضائح الباطني was one of them, but that's, of course, Al-Mustadhiri, named the name is named after the Caliph Al-Mustadhir Billah, the Abbasid Caliph. And four influential textbooks of law according to the Shafi'ite right. But many would argue that his most characteristic and impressive contribution to the evolution of Islam lay in the realm of spiritual method. His was a life of introspection, doubt, and unmistakable sincerity, which bestowed on him a gift for recognizing inward purity and the techniques by which man may achieve it. He was distressed by what he saw as excessive formalism of the day, in which brilliant scholars expounded texts of the greatest complexity, but with intentions tainted by vainglory. In his most interesting work, The Revival of Religious Sciences, Ihya Ulumuddin, one senses a conviction that the righteous elite had been corroded, expressed with an urgency which can only have been intensified by the political vagaries of the period and the fragile position of the doctrine and law school to which he belonged. Imam Ghazali also, in the introduction to Ihya Ulumuddin, he he lamented the lack of scholars, and by this he means the spiritual scholars who were genuinely, and he lamented those who were professional scholars who were simply interested in the material gains, those who simply wanted to have a position, a formal position whereby they can lay their hands on the monies of others, including of orphans. But throughout the book, one can detect that line first and foremost against that type of scholars. Deliverance could only come through a rekindling of that sincerity and sanctity for which the early generations of Islam had been celebrated by means of passing through the refiner's fire of self-noting. The resulting clarity of soul not only resulted in personal integrity, it opened the way for the supernal light to flood in from above. This methodology, he discovered, lay in that mystical tradition which since about the 3rd century of Islam had been known as Sufism. So it did exist, but the naming, that's really the difference. To outline the history of Muslim mysticism is not our purpose in this introduction. Many excellent accounts are available elsewhere. Instead, we shall content ourselves with exploring those trends which were directly formative of Ghazali's influential system of ethics and psychomy. The, of course, this struggle, one might say, there are several meanings, between soul and body, if you will, between the sublime aims and the lowly desires, though there is something, of course, the without denying the natural aspect. It's the extreme materialism. It is now a commonplace. Imam Ghazali the Abd Hakim Murad continues, but one which bears repeating, that from the time when Louis Massegnon's work on Sufi terminology appeared, if not before, most Western scholars have acquiesced in Sufism's own claim to an Islamic spiritual provenance. In his Essai sur le régime du lexique technique de la mystique musulmane, first published in 1922, the French Orientalist, still referring to Massignon, informed both by a mastery of the text and by his own ecumenical vision, showed that the manner in which the classical derivation of Sufi lexis from the Quran and Hadith, far from being an exercise in mauvais foi, bad faith, if you will, or an attempt to hoodwink the Orthodox, was both historically and methodologically authentic, against the traditional Orientalist dismissal of the Muslim source texts as outpourings of an arid legalism, and the claim that the richness of medieval Muslim spirituality must perforce be the product of foreign influence. He argued convincingly that it was the Prophet's intense and sustained experience of God, supported by his moral excellence, which provided the ultimate reference for Sufism. Thus, the Quranic citations, which often introduce each chapter in the classical Sufi texts, are not justifications but archetypes and commands. Of course, you would know that a typical book or subtitle of the 40 books of Hayyan al-Din, or any subdivision, typically it starts with the verses of the Quran, followed by the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, and then the athar from the that are attributed either to companions of the Prophet ﷺ or to subsequent generations, typically from amongst the tabi'in, or even those who come thereafter. Talking about the arid legalism, yes, but it was not really, this should not be used as obviously the case that the origin was arid. Again, this is the project of Imam Al-Ghazali, was the original Islamic worldview does include, not only that includes spirituality, in fact, the legal verses of the Quran are in you will find that scholars differed on the number of verses in the of the Quran. Some of them would as little as a couple of hundred verses about legal issues. The rest is really about faith and spirituality and morality. This is the end of the preliminary remarks and introduction. Next is self-noting in Islamic scriptures. Inshallah, we will begin the next session with this topic, though it is also lengthy, and I doubt that we will be able, but we'll attempt to also read the second part in the next session as much as possible, of course, inshallah. Until then, subhanakallah wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.